By the first week of September 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army had done something no military planner in Washington had fully anticipated. It had moved so fast it outran the war itself. In less than 8 weeks since the breakout at Avranches, Patton's armored columns had swept across 400 miles of French countryside, liberated city after city, and pushed the Wehrmacht into a full retreat. The German High Command was watching the situation with barely concealed panic. Patton was not supposed to be here yet. Nobody was. And then the tanks stopped, not because of German resistance, not because of a strategic redeployment order from Schaeff. The tanks stopped because they ran out of fuel, and the fuel, according to every official allocation sheet, should have been sitting in forward supply depots waiting for them. It wasn't. This is the story of where that fuel went, who took it, what Patton did when he found out, and why the full accounting of what happened in those supply depots in the fall of 1944 was kept out of the headlines for decades. The Red Ball Express is one of the great logistical achievements of the Second World War, and most histories treat it exactly that way, as a triumph of American improvisation and Black American soldiering under extraordinary pressure. That story is true. Roughly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers from quartermaster and truck companies, men who drove around the clock on a one-way circuit of roads stretching from the Normandy beaches to the front lines, hauling fuel, ammunition, and rations in 2.5-ton GMC trucks with the engines running hot and the speedometers pegged. At its peak in late August 1944, the Express was moving nearly 12,500 tons of supplies per day. The drivers worked in shifts of 18 hours. Some fell asleep at the wheel and drove into ditches. Some were strafed by Luftwaffe aircraft, making desperate low-altitude runs on the supply routes. They kept driving. But the Red Ball Express was also a system under catastrophic strain. And catastrophic strain creates gaps in oversight, gaps in documentation, gaps in accountability, and into those gaps, certain men inserted themselves very deliberately. The scale of what was being moved made perfect fraud easy. A shipment of 5,000 gallons of aviation fuel leaves a depot in Cherbourg. It is logged at the point of origin. It is supposed to be logged again at the receiving depot closer to the front. But the receiving depot is a temporary fuel point set up in a bombed-out French farm compound, staffed by exhausted men who have been awake for 36 hours, and the officer responsible for signing the receipt is not always there when the trucks arrive. Or the paperwork is filled out in advance and backdated. Or a truck simply diverts from the route before it reaches the destination, and nobody at either end asks hard questions. Because hard questions require time, and time is the one thing nobody in the fall of 1944 supply chain actually had. According to a combat report filed in September 1944, Third Army Logistics Officer Colonel Walter J. Muller noted simply, "Supply shortfalls at forward depots do not match reported delivery figures." That single line, buried in a routine status report, was the first thread pulled in what would become one of the most damaging internal scandals of the European theater. Patton knew something was wrong before the formal investigation began. He knew it because he understood his tanks. A Sherman M4 burned roughly 1 gallon of fuel per mile under ideal road conditions, and conditions in the fall of 1944 were never ideal. Cross-country movement, mud, the constant idle of engines waiting for route clearance. The consumption rate climbed fast. Patton had done the arithmetic himself. He knew exactly how many gallons his armored divisions required per day to sustain the advance he was planning. And he knew exactly how many gallons Schaeff had allocated to Third Army. The numbers, if everything was functioning correctly, were tight but workable. The problem was that the numbers on paper and the numbers in the actual fuel tanks were not the same numbers. His 4th Armored Division, arguably the finest armored unit in the United States Army at that point in the war, was reporting fuel states of less than a quarter tank on multiple vehicles. Combat Command B of the 4th Armored had enough fuel on the morning of September 6th to advance approximately 30 miles. The German city of Metz was sitting within striking distance. The Siegfried Line was not far beyond that, and Patton's tanks were effectively stationary. He called it a crime. Not a logistical failure, not an administrative breakdown, a crime. That distinction mattered enormously to Patton, and it should matter to anyone trying to understand what came next. The formal inquiry was assigned to officers from Third Army's Inspector General Section, But Patton made clear from the beginning that he intended to be personally informed of every development in real time. He was not content to receive a written report 3 weeks later. He wanted names. He wanted specific locations. He wanted the paper trail laid out in front of him in physical form so he could trace it himself. What the investigation uncovered over the following days was a picture both more organized and more opportunistic than anyone had initially assumed. The theft was not a single incident. It was a pattern, a loose network of transactions involving at least 2 supply officers and an unknown number of enlisted men working as drivers and depot laborers, most of whom appeared to have participated under varying degrees of coercion or inducement. The fuel, once diverted, moved through a shadow logistics chain that terminated at black market contacts in Paris and in smaller French towns along the supply routes. At the Paris end, American military fuel was being sold to French civilians, to collaborators, and in some documented cases to individuals whose loyalties and connections were, to put it delicately, not fully established. The 2 officers most directly implicated were a captain assigned to a quartermaster fuel supply company and a first lieutenant serving as a depot records officer. Both men had access to the documentation that would have made diversion visible. Both men had the authority, within their roles, to adjust records, authorize loading manifests, and approve route deviations without triggering immediate scrutiny. The captain, in particular, had been in his position long enough to understand exactly where the oversight gaps were, and had been exploiting them methodically for weeks. According to a statement recorded by Third Army Inspector General, investigators in September 1944, a senior enlisted man in the fuel company noted simply, "The captain told us the paperwork was handled. We loaded what we were told." The enlisted men at the bottom of this structure were, in many ways, the most tragic element of the entire affair. Soldiers who had been placed in an impossible position by officers who outranked them and who had, in the chaos and exhaustion of a supply operation running at the absolute edge of its capacity, made choices they might not have made under any other circumstances. This is not an excuse. It is a fact of what institutional corruption actually looks like when it metastasizes inside a military organization under combat stress. Patton did not see it that way, at least not initially. What Patton saw was a direct line between the missing fuel and the stopped tanks, and between the stopped tanks and the German divisions that were even now digging in along the Moselle River, reinforcing the very positions that his 4th Armored could have overrun 2 weeks earlier if his fuel allocations had been delivered as recorded. Every day his advance was delayed was a day the Wehrmacht used to reconstitute. Every hour Metz held out was an hour that cost American lives not in a theoretical sense, but in the immediate, physical sense of men being killed in skirmishes and patrol actions that would not have been necessary if the breakthrough had happened on schedule. The fuel that was stolen was not an abstraction to Patton. It was dead Americans. The question of how Patton handled the 2 officers outside of, or at least parallel to, the formal court-martial process is where this story becomes genuinely complicated, and where the historical record becomes deliberately incomplete. What is documented is this. Both officers were relieved of their commands immediately upon the conclusion of the initial investigation. Both were removed from the theater of operations. The captain was subsequently court-martialed. The proceedings resulted in a conviction and a sentence that included reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and confinement. The first lieutenant faced a separate proceeding. The records of both courts-martial exist in the National Archives, though some supporting documentation was either lost or withheld during post-war records management. What is less documented but consistent across multiple after-action accounts and the recollections of Third Army staff officers recorded in oral history projects decades later is that Patton confronted the captain personally before the formal proceedings began, not in a hearing room, not through intermediaries. In person, with witnesses present, in a manner that several of those witnesses later described as something between an interrogation and a condemnation. Patton was not a man who believed that institutional process adequately conveyed the moral weight of certain offenses, and the theft of combat fuel in a theater where men were dying constituted, in his judgment, an offense of moral weight that no paperwork could fully express. What he said to that captain in that room is not on record. What is on record is that the captain reportedly did not speak during the encounter that Patton spoke, and the captain stood at attention and listened, and that when it was over, the captain was escorted from the building by military police. looking at what that officer had done, systematically diverting fuel from combat units in an active theater, selling it through black market channels while his own country's soldiers sat immobile in the mud waiting for resupply. What would you have done if you were the commanding general? What does military justice actually look like when the crime is not a battlefield violation but a betrayal of the men fighting the battle? Tell me in the comments, because what happened next in Patton's command went well beyond those two officers, and most of it was never publicly discussed. The broader context of the fuel theft cannot be understood without understanding the specific crisis it created in September and October of 1944, a crisis that reverberated all the way up to Eisenhower's headquarters and that has been the subject of serious historical debate ever since. The supply crisis of autumn 1944 had multiple causes, and it would be historically irresponsible to lay all of it at the feet of corruption and theft. The fundamental problem was architectural. The Allies had planned for a campaign that would be resupplied primarily through the port of Antwerp, but Antwerp was not cleared and operational until late November 1944, far later than planners had assumed. The Red Ball Express was operating at the outer limit of what truck-based logistics could physically accomplish over those distances. Fuel was genuinely scarce at the system level, but within that genuine scarcity, theft made an already dire situation catastrophically worse. Estimates compiled after the war by Army Service Forces analysts suggested that black market diversion of petroleum products from the Red Ball Express supply chain may have accounted for between 10 and 15% of total losses in some depot-level accounting periods. That number is contested by some historians and supported by others. What is not contested is that the losses were real, that they were documented in internal Army audits, and that the Army's response to the problem was, to put it charitably, uneven. Patton, for his part, was not interested in image management. He was interested in accountability, and he pushed Third Army's Inspector General to document the full scope of what had happened with a thoroughness that made some of his superiors uncomfortable. The reports generated by that investigation were detailed, specific, and damning not just of the two primary officers, but of the systemic conditions that had allowed the theft to occur and persist undetected for as long as it had. Those reports were classified. Several remained classified for decades after the war. When they were eventually declassified and deposited in the National Archives, they received almost no press attention, because by then the war had been over for 40 years and the news cycle had moved on permanently. The enlisted men implicated in the operation were handled differently than the officers, in ways that reflected both the realities of military justice at the time and the complicated moral calculus of judging men who were operating under direct orders from their superiors. Some received administrative punishment reduction in grade, loss of pay, reassignment. A smaller number faced formal proceedings. The record suggests that investigators and prosecutors made distinctions based on the degree of apparent volition. Soldiers who had clearly been coerced or had participated in a single incident were treated differently from those who appeared to have been willing, ongoing participants. This was not a perfectly consistent application of justice. Wartime military justice is never perfectly consistent. The resources for investigation and prosecution were limited. The backlog of cases was enormous, and the pressing need to keep the Army functioning meant that personnel could not be pulled from critical roles for extended legal proceedings without cost to the operational mission. These are explanations, not justifications, and Patton, who was aware of the inconsistencies, registered his dissatisfaction in terms that were characteristically direct. According to a diary entry recorded by Patton's aide in October 1944, Patton stated simply, "The thieves are handled. The system that made theft easy is not." That observation was accurate then. It remained accurate at the end of the war. The black market economy that had grown up around Allied supply lines in France was not a minor footnote to the campaign. It was a substantial criminal enterprise that cost the Allied war effort an estimated $500 million in materiel by some post-war estimates, funded in part by fuel, food, and equipment that had been requisitioned by the United States Army, transported at the cost of lives and labor, and then sold for personal profit by men in American uniforms. The fuel crisis of September 1944 had one more consequence that deserves to be named directly. It almost certainly extended the war. This is a serious claim, and it should be made seriously. The argument is not that Patton alone could have ended the war in 1944. The logistical constraints were real, Eisenhower's broad front strategy was contested within the Allied command for reasons beyond Patton's fuel allocation, and the German military, despite being in full strategic retreat, retained a capacity for defensive resistance that should not be underestimated. But the consensus among historians who have examined the operational record in detail is that the fuel shortfall of early September 1,944 foreclosed options that existed at that specific moment and did not exist 6 weeks later. The Wehrmacht used those 6 weeks. The Siegfried Line was reinforced. The Moselle crossings were contested. Metz, which might have fallen quickly in early September, became a 6-week siege that was not concluded until mid-November. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944. The war in Europe did not end until May 8, 1945. Between those two dates, tens of thousands of American soldiers died. The connection between stolen fuel in September and American deaths in December and January is not a direct line. History does not work that way. But it is not an irrelevant connection either. The men who diverted that fuel did not do so in a moral vacuum. They did it in a theater where the consequences of operational delays were measured in human lives, and the historical record does not allow us to pretend otherwise. Patton understood this. He had understood it in September, when he was staring at fuel state reports from his armored divisions and doing the arithmetic. He understood it in October, when his army was fighting for Moselle crossings that should have been behind him. He understood it in December, when the Third Army made its famous 90-degree turn north in the snow to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver that remains one of the most remarkable feats of operational execution in the history of the United States Army, carried out under conditions of extreme cold, extreme logistical pressure, and extreme time constraint. The temperature at Bastogne on December 22, 1944, was below 0 Fahrenheit. The men of the 101st Airborne, who had been holding that crossroads town against repeated German armored assaults for 6 days, had almost no winter equipment. The supply system had failed to deliver cold weather gear in the 4 weeks before the German offensive. They had almost no artillery ammunition. They had, in the famous exchange between General Anthony McAuliffe and the German commander who demanded his surrender, nothing to offer but a single word: nuts. Patton's Third Army covered 60 miles in less than 48 hours, through snow and ice to reach them. The fuel this time was there. The captain who had been court-martialed for the September theft was by then sitting in a military detention facility. He would be released sometime after the war's end. His name does not appear in any of the major histories of the European campaign. He returned to civilian life, as most men did, and what became of him after that point is not recorded in any archive this researcher has been able to locate. The lieutenant received a less severe sentence and was separated from the service without honor. His name is similarly absent from the standard histories. The enlisted men who drove the diverted trucks, loaded the unauthorized manifests, and kept their mouths shut because a captain told them the paperwork was handled, most of them went home after the war. Some went back to farms in Georgia and Ohio and California. Some went to cities and built lives. Most of them never talked about what had happened in those supply depots in France in the fall of 1944, and there is no record of any of them being asked. The Red Ball Express itself was deactivated on November 16, 1944, after 81 days of continuous operation. In that time, its drivers had transported approximately 412,000 tons of supplies along more than 700 miles of designated routes. Thousands of drivers, the vast majority of them black soldiers serving in a segregated army that would not be formally desegregated for another 4 years, had performed one of the most demanding logistical tasks in the history of mechanized warfare under conditions that their country would not fully acknowledge or honor for generations. Their record stands entirely apart from the corruption that infected portions of the supply chain they served. The theft was committed by officers and their collaborators. The driving was done by men who had no part in it and no power to prevent it. Patton never publicly credited the Red Ball Express drivers by name. Public credit was not his idiom. What he did was fight, relentlessly and without apology, for the fuel and ammunition and supply throughput that his army needed. And when that throughput was compromised by internal theft, he treated it with the same ferocity he brought to every other threat to his army's combat effectiveness. The Third Army's final accounting speaks for itself. From the breakout at Avranches in August 1944 to the German surrender in May 1945, Patton's command had liberated or captured more than 81,000 square miles of territory, taken approximately 1,010,000 prisoners of war, and inflicted casualties on the Wehrmacht that contributed materially to the final collapse of German military resistance in the West. The Third Army crossed the Rhine. It drove deep into Germany. At the moment of Germany's surrender, elements of the Third Army were inside Czechoslovakia. It had done all of this despite the fuel theft of September 1944. And because of what Patton did when he found out about it, it had done it without that particular form of betrayal happening again. There is no monument to the fuel that was stolen. There is no memorial to the operational opportunities that closed while Patton's tanks sat dry on the roads of Lorraine. The men who died in the Hurtgen forest and at Bastogne and along the Siegfried Line in the winter of 1944 did not leave accounts of what might have been different if the supply chain had been clean. They left names on headstones in American military cemeteries in Belgium and Luxembourg and Germany, cemeteries that are still maintained today. Row after row of white crosses and stars of David in carefully kept grass, each one marking the place where a calculation went wrong somewhere upstream, in a depot, on a manifest, in a decision made by a man in an American uniform who decided that the war was also a business opportunity. Patton is buried at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg. He died on December 21st, 1945, 6 months after the German surrender, from injuries sustained in a road accident near Mannheim. He was 60 years old. He had commanded armies in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He had never lost a battle he was properly supplied to fight. The last entry in his diary, written in the days before his accident, contained no final summation of the war, no accounting of his victories, no reflection on what he had accomplished. It was a practical note about a hunting trip he was planning. Patton to the end. The supply officers who stole his fuel are forgotten. The tanks that stopped because of them are in museums now, painted olive drab, with placards explaining their specifications. The roads they should have driven in September 1944 run through prosperous French towns where nobody remembers the war in any detail that would be uncomfortable to remember. The fuel is long gone. The cost of it is still being counted.